Hello, this is Adam from the podcast series Here is the Horror. Before today's episode, I have a short announcement about the series going forward. Due to limited time for production, my co-host Daniel and I have agreed that all future episodes will need to be a bit shorter in length. Some listeners have also said that they would prefer a shorter length, so hopefully this benefits everyone. Our recording of an episode covering the Silent Hill series ran especially long, so we'll be cutting the episode into 3 mini-sodes about the series, released across this week. Our regular show will resume as usual the following week, but for now, thanks for listening, enjoy the mini-sode, and stay horrified.
Today, on Here is the Horror.
How do you know about that? Aren't you Maria?
I'm not your Mary.
So, you're Maria?
I am. If you want me to be.
All I want from you is an answer.
It doesn't matter who I am. I'm here for you, James. See? I'm real. Don't you want to touch me?
I don't know.
So that will bring us to the next game in the series, Silent Hill 2. But I want to preface that a little bit before we get into it. Silent Hill 2 has an amazing legacy. It's probably one of the most lauded survival horror games ever, which is great, but at the same time I think it's a little problematic. The future of the franchise has been very hit or miss for years. And I think a lot of that has to do with the fact that as survival horror fans, or even as just gamers, when we have something as impactful as Silent Hill 2, we tend to use it as the benchmark for everything that follows. And I think that's something that needs to be moved past so that we can get something new and impactful in the franchise. There are plenty of merits that Silent Hill 2 has. I won't debate that, but at the same time, sometimes you just have to give up the ghost and allow yourself to move on. I don't mean that as a critique to the game. It's just something that I've kind of noticed. In the show notes, I'll actually link to a nice article I read recently that goes a lot more in depth to that than what I'm saying now for time constraints. But now we can get into it. Silent Hill 2 Restless Dreams 2001.
For the PlayStation 2, one of the early games for that system. I remember everyone being really hyped for this game when it was initially coming out. Funnily enough, even though I have a ton of respect for this game in modern context, I actually wasn't too big on this one when it first came out. Because I remembered reading stuff at the time that people thought the first one was too scary, so they tried to tone it down at the time. Although, looking back now, obviously, this mostly meant a move away from like visceral gore and more a shift into psychological horror.
Yeah, Silent Hill 2 definitely has its visual moments, but it's much more an exploration of the human psyche. One of the more notable inspirations for this game is an 1886 book, Crime and Punishment, which is about a poor former student who plans to murder a pawnbroker and use the money to do great things. Then the realization sets on him after the fact, unfortunately, that he's just mentally assaulted by the guilt and disgust over what he did. He starts to slowly succumb to paranoia and the truth of his actions, and his flimsy justifications fall apart, and he realizes that he is going to have to answer for what he's done. And that will definitely be reflected in this game.
Yeah, maybe we should go ahead and say what the game's actually about to a degree, which is the main character in this game is, instead of Harry Mason, this game has no real ties to the first game other than that it's set in Silent Hill. But there's none of the cult stuff from the first game in it. In this game, it's just a man named James Sunderland, whose wife had recently passed away. But then he gets a mysterious letter saying that she's in a resort town that they had good memories in called Silent Hill and wants him to come meet her there. Which he knows his wife is dead, but the letter is undeniably her handwriting, so he can't resist going there and trying to see what is there, if anything.
Mechanically, this game will follow Silent Hill very closely. There's only minor mechanical changes, such as James moving his head to acknowledge enemies and items, and there tends to be a slightly greater focus on puzzles and riddles over combat in this game. Not to say that does not have plenty of combat in it. We're going to see a lot of things established in this game that would be elaborated on more as the series goes on. Firstly, we get this type of theory that Silent Hill as a town reflects on the perception of the individual. As the game goes on, there are a lot of changes that reflect this, that show this in both minor and major ways, and it's pertinent to note that the lone, truly innocent character in this game doesn't see any monsters. And I stated earlier, this is Silent Hill 2, Silent Hill 2 Restless Dreams. The game was initially released on the PS2. When it was released on the Xbox, we got Silent Hill 2 Restless Dreams, which would be in the European release and the greatest hits and director's cut release of Silent Hill 2. This includes Born from a Wish, which is a short scenario where you play as a character from the game. You get the extra UFO ending, and there's updated lighting and textures. And in this version, the base game would come to be referred to as Letter from Silent Heaven.
And getting back into the actual game, I know, like I said, this game focuses a bit more on psychological horror, but I think beyond that, the horror style of this game shifts a lot more towards just trying to make you feel uncomfortable and tense a majority of the time. For instance, whereas in Silent Hill 1, the opening is you have this nightmare where you're in the dark with barbed wire and corpses and people stabbing you. Silent Hill 2's opening, conversely, is you just start out in a dingy, grimy, dirty, filthy restroom and then have to walk down a long mountain pass to the town where nothing actually attacks you. You just keep hearing unsettling sounds and things scurrying through the bushes, and the audio designed in such a way that you expect something at any moment, but it never comes. Until eventually you finally reach the town, which I know in an interview they said that they specifically designed it to try to make that stretch so long that by the time you finally run into a monster, running back to the safety of your car no longer feels like a viable option. And you'll see a lot of similar scares like this too, like the infamous one where there's the hole in the wall that James it asks you if you want to reach in to try to see if there's something in there, and when you do, he reacts like he's feeling something in there and the controller vibrates, but nothing actually happens. And there's a lot of those scenes like that just create tension but don't actually give you the payoff, which in a way doesn't give you that release, so it just continues feeling tense. And even the monster design's also heavily different in this game. Part 1 had monsters all over the place. Most of them not very human, though. You know, it was things like flying bat creatures, worm creatures, dogs.
The spitters.
Mm-hmm. I think you had some ape-like ones late in the game, but for Silent Hill 2, Masahiro Ito, the monster designer, said that he thought things like, fangs, teeth, and tails all evoke fear of animals, and he wanted to focus on fear of humans. So you won't find any things like that aren't on humans, and the creatures in this, they all just look like humans that something really wrong happened to, but you're not quite sure what.
And this would also establish a franchise-long appearance for some of the more notable monsters in the series, like the nurse, for example, who is drastically different from how it appeared in Silent Hill 1. And it's one of the first enemies you will see that you get a really heavy Jacob's Ladder vibe from.
A lot of these things you probably really couldn't have done on PS1 just because of the texture resolution limitations, but here they really make a lot of things look really uncomfortable and strange, and you get a lot more of that jerky, twitchy movement from the enemies. Something else that Silent Hill 2 does that really sets it apart from 1 is it does still have the other world, but in Silent Hill 1, whenever you went to the other world, it was always rust and barbed wire. In Silent Hill 2, instead of that aesthetic, whenever you go to the other world, instead it's a sort of decayed look where everything seems like moist and mildew and mold. And I think Silent Hill 2 overall has a big water theme with it, like the title screen has water on it also, and the place you're trying to get to for the whole game is onto the lake. And one of the endings, of course, is you driving your car to the lake.
So, early game, you're going to have James bump into the rest of the human cast of the game. He's going to meet the runaway Angela. He's going to meet Eddie, who unsettled me from the first time I met him.
Really? Angela unsettled me more.
For me, Angela was more of a trope-type character. I'd seen her character in a lot of other mediums. But Eddie, right off the bat, I got the feeling that there's something up with this guy. It obviously didn't turn out the way I thought it would, but I felt like he was a setup from the get-go. You also meet Laura. She's a young girl who knew Mary, and she chews your ass out for not loving her.
Which, of course, makes James suspect she knows something about Mary, but Laura just keeps running away from him and being a little brat, kicking keys out of the way.
Yeah, pretty much. Not too much longer after this, you will find Maria, the Psycho Mary.
Yep, it's a woman that looks exactly like his dead wife, but is not his dead wife.
And she acts like a psychopath.
Yeah, she's very flirtatious, but also constantly insulting and mocking you.
Yes, she can be very embracive and very loving, often from one sentence to the other. And going back to one of my earlier points, if after you meet Maria, you head back to where you encountered your first monster, and let me go ahead and say that this was probably just to keep you from getting back to that area, the beginning area at this point in the game. But if you return to where you met your first monster, there's now crime scene tape, and you can't get back through. And for me, this kind of lends a bit of credence to the fact that Silent Hill is based off of an individual's perception. This would kind of get played with a little bit more in Silent Hill 3, but there's different ways you can take that, but I'm getting ahead of myself.
Well, at this point, I guess we've met Angela, who's the seemingly shy, awkward, nervous girl who's came to Silent Hill to look for her mama. And then you have Eddie and Laura, who came there for undisclosed reasons from Eddie. Laura's there to look for Mary also, who she knew in the hospital.
And to make sure James knows what a piece of crap he is.
Mm-hmm. And then you have Maria, who's just there to also make sure James knows what a piece of crap he is.
Pretty much.
And I think the only character we haven't mentioned yet is probably the most popular one.
Well, yeah, because shortly after, you'll go to the hospital to look for Mary, and then you meet who I presume you're talking about.
Conehead, but not the popular Dan Aykroyd character.
Yes, probably one of the, if not the most iconic creature in all of the Silent Hill franchise. Even people I know that have never played a survival horror game know who Pyramid Head is, whether it be because of the movies or the memes he's been a part of. He shows up and does for James, I would say, a favor, and he kills the psychopath.
Eventually, but...
But apparently he's not that great at the job anyways, because you will shortly thereafter find Maria alive.
In a very memorable and uncomfortable cutscene.
Yes, you find her well and completely dismissive of any of the previous events in the hospital.
Yeah, and that scene's actually, if you wait at the title screen, it'll play for you, and I think that's probably because that scene's really a good summation of the whole plot of what's going on with the game. Mary died, and you came here to find her, and then Maria died. But then you see her, but she's behind bars, out of reach, and just sort of taunting you and telling James that, but then she starts saying things that only Mary would know.
Yes, she starts to give you the idea that maybe she's a stalker, because she knows a lot of stuff about James and Mary's relationship that no one else would know.
I don't think it's so much a stalker as just like James asks her in the scene, he says, "Are you Mary?" To which she replies, "I'm whatever you need me to be. Want me to be?" Something like that.
Well, I'm speaking more from an everyman's point. As I mentioned before, James takes everything that is happening here in stride incredibly well.
Yeah, well, this whole game has a much more surreal vibe to it to the first one. Everyone seems a little off and out of it in this game. To its credit, it actually works really good with the tone of the game.
In my personal opinion, Maria escaped from the Black Lodge. She's not even from Silent Hill.
No, Laura's the one from Twin Peaks, remember?
True. Well, she's not wrapped in a plastic bag.
As much as James might wish she was.
Yeah, he's already proved he's a pretty crappy husband. He probably doesn't need to give a hand at being a father. After this, James decides he wants to head to the hotel that him and Mary used to stay at. Later on, big surprise, Maria's dead again. Shortly after this, James will run into Angela again, where he saves her, and she will divulge to him that she was a victim of sexual abuse. Later, you can possibly find a news article that explains that Angela had murdered her father because of the sexual abuse, and she fled, which is what led her to Silent Hill. This gives kind of a change in how you feel about her. It takes it from a nervousness around her and anxiety to a bit more of a sympathetic view. After this, James runs into Eddie again. And this is when we learn that Eddie is probably a psychopath or a serial killer. None of this is explicitly stated, but his behavior here is a very common tactic of the two latter mentioned types of individuals. He uses a traumatic childhood where he was bullied. He uses a lot of external circumstances that a lot of people experience and turn out just fine to excuse and justify some pretty heinous actions as a younger person. He maimed one of his childhood bullies and then killed his dog, which, I don't know. That sounds like a completely reasonable reaction to getting bullied for being fat. I mean, I was bullied as a child. I never killed anyone's dog. I may have wanted to beat someone up, but I didn't want to permanently maim them. But this causes his psyche to completely fracture. This causes him to have the inability to accept any questioning, any minor slight, or any minor criticism for what it is, and causes him to view it as a direct attack on him. This happens with James when he simply asks him a question that, considering the situation we're in, is very mild, and he becomes completely deranged and unhinged and attacks James, which forces James to unfortunately have to kill him. I should mention at this time too, Eddie, who has been traveling around with Laura, gets incredibly berated and harassed by this very small child, who then runs away. It's never explicitly shown or stated, but I think the relationship he had with Laura is a little creepy. I think he kept the child around, so he had someone he knew he could control. That's just something I got from the interactions between the two. But then she basically calls him a fatty fat and runs away from him.
Yeah, I don't know about all that. I know it does actually, in the opening of the game, it sort of shows that he was her ride to Silent Hill. So I like to imagine that after he killed the dog and shot the guy, he just needed to get out of town, and she needed a lift, and from her he got the idea to go to Silent Hill, is how I interpreted that. Then you can meet them both in a bowling alley having a pizza.
Yeah. But that shows you a little bit more of Eddie, too. Having performed all these heinous actions, he then decides it is completely okay to pick up a young child on the side of the road and drive her across the country. Why not stop at a gas station and call the police and say, hey, I picked up this wandering child? I think if Eddie had ended up in some small town instead of Silent Hill, we might have seen a true crime documentary about him years later. That remains to be shown because he died in a freezer, hiding behind pig carcasses.
In one of the worst boss fights in the series.
It's more like hide and seek than a fight, because you beat him up a little bit and he runs and hides behind a carcass.
I recall it just being us standing point blank with our guns in each other's faces and then just firing until he runs into the next room.
Yeah, pretty much. After this, James finally reaches the hotel. He finds an exposition that gives you some background, and mind blown. James killed his wife. It was a mercy killing, of course, but...
Yeah, we didn't specify too much her cause of death, but basically she was just horribly sick and bedridden for a long time. And in the game, you'd seen some stuff up to this point not really matching up, like how recently Laura said that she'd known Mary was much more recently than James remembered Mary dying. But we'll end up finding out here that when he remembered Mary dying was actually just when the doctor pronounced that she was terminal and only had a certain amount of time left to live.
Well, and this kind of gives us, too, a new look at James where, was it truly a mercy killing? Was it a desperation, a spur of the moment? Was it him wanting to relieve himself of a burden? And, of course, the game ramps up from this point forward. That is going to be a running theme in what kind of person James is. After this, James notices that the letter he received from his deceased wife is now completely blank. You bump into Angela again, and after some conversation, she realizes that she just can't cope with what she did any longer, whether it was justified or not. She walks into a fire and disappears for the rest of the game.
And has that pretty infamous, when James sees all the flames that she's walking into, he reacts, she's surprised he can see it too, and then says, "For me, it's always like this," which sort of implies that how every person has their own version of Silent Hill, that while his is this damp, mildew, mold version of Silent Hill, that hers is a fire version.
Basically hell, in the popularized sense.
Which I guess the opposite of him having a water version and her having a fire version kind of matches up with their reasons for being there, being opposites as well.
Well, we've established at this point that she's guilty of defending herself.
Well, he killed somebody that he couldn't be with anymore, and she killed somebody that she didn't want to be with.
Exactly.
And of course, at this point, we know that Eddie killed a dog and wounded somebody else, and Laura, who presumably is the only innocent person here, is therefore the only person that doesn't see any monsters here.
And this all plays back into what we were talking about earlier with Silent Hill being representative of the individual. And not to say that there aren't different parts of Silent Hill. You know, there's an urban part, there's a rural part, there's amusement parks. Just wherever you're at in the town is going to warp into pretty much your own purgatory.
And similar to how everybody had their own monsters or inner demons in Silent Hill 2, I think it's probably worth noting also that just like the letter from Mary disappeared from your inventory, Maria also, if you look back on the game, never appears around James when anybody else is around. She's likely just another manifestation of his personal sins.
So the next big thing that happens is, surprise, surprise, Maria's alive again. Or maybe she never died. We don't know. What we do know is that not one, but two pyramid heads show up and kill her really good. At this point, James finally starts to realize that the monsters he's seeing are all different manifestations of his psyche and of his guilt, and Pyramid Head seems to represent James's need to be pursued and punished for what he's done. And at this realization, we're treated to one of my favorite scenes in the game. When I initially played through the game, this surprised me more than anything, because I was like, oh my god, how am I supposed to fight two of these guys at one time? Instead, they do you a favor. Maybe the bell went off and it was time for them to clock out because they both impale themselves. And you get to get the Pyramid Head knife.
Yeah, it's probably worth noting, while you have fought Pyramid Head before this point, you've never really beaten him. It just sort of seems like he gets bored and walks off. James needs him because he's there to punish himself, but once James undergoes his catharsis and accepts what he's done, there's no more need for Pyramid Head.
You continue to make your way forward, and depending on the choices you've made so far in the game, you will either find Mary or Maria pretending to be Mary waiting for you. This will lead you into the final boss fight of the game, and this was a really nice boss fight for me, were it not for one thing. Aesthetically, the transformation of Mary Maria and what she becomes is very nice. It's unique to what I had seen in other games at the time, but this kind of tenderly barbed wired, upside down hospital bed, I don't know, it's like you're fighting the grimdark version of Rogan Z. As I said, there was one thing that kind of hampered my enjoyment of this boss fight my first time, because I had like 2 shots and I think the hunting rifle. I wasted both of those, so I had to fight the final boss of the game with Silent Hill's trademark pipe. Do you know how hard it is to hit a floating murder bed with a pipe?
I hope to never have to know how hard that is.
Do you know how many times I died in that boss fight?
At least once you finish pumping all your ammo into her and she falls on the ground, the fight doesn't end immediately. She writhes around for a while waiting for you to do the finishing blow. And I equipped the pyramid head sword for that because it just seemed appropriate, but I recall a friend of ours thinking that was in very poor taste. Since so much of this game is so symbolic, almost all the bosses have a heavy relevance to the characters. I was never really very clear on what this specific last boss was supposed to be, because it seems like James has finally come to terms with the fact that he murdered his wife, and his catharsis for that is to murder his wife. Unless it's just you, I suppose, repeating the act again to get that symbiosis with yourself.
Well, I always kind of saw it as it was a reflection of James' perceived resentment from Mary over what he did. Whether imagined or not, it was his feeling that his wife died disappointed, angry, or hating him, and it was the dark part of his subconscious, and he released it onto this phantom of Mary, this revenant, so that he could physically deal with it and move past it.
Oh yeah, because before the boss fight, you do get this scene where he's recalling memories of how she treated him when she was in the hospital, and it's a really sad scene where you just hear her screaming at him to go away, and then once he agrees to, she starts sobbing and begging him to come back, because obviously she's just mentally and physically exhausted because of this disease killing her, and she wants him there but also hates that she's subjecting him to it. And so I suppose in a way it could also be interpreted as him banishing away what she had become so that he can recall who she really was again, because after the fight you have a very tender conversation with Mary.
And depending on what version of the game you're playing, you can have anywhere of up to a total of 6 endings, 7 if you count Born from a Wish. What I consider to probably be the only good ending is called Leave, and in it James has one last meeting with Mary, he reads her letter, and then leaves the town with Laura in tow. The one you spoke of earlier, Water, James decides, I'm a piece of trash, gets in his car, and drives it off a cliff into a lake.
And I've seen it theorized by people a lot that if you do that ending, then that means that Mary's dead body was in your trunk this whole time. Do you have any idea where that theory comes from? Because I don't recall anything insinuating that.
No, but I mean it would make sense. I could see that, definitely being viable, but then that would place the time of Mary's death and James's arrival in Silent Hill within hours, maybe a day. You have the Maria ending, which sees Mary refusing to forgive James for killing her, which is kind of where I developed the whole thought process of James's perceived anger manifesting as the final boss. And after he defeats her, the bed frame battle, which I think this was the ending I got the first game. James leaves with Maria, but it implies that the cycle will kind of continue because as the two are leaving Silent Hill, Maria starts coughing.
Oh yeah, I mean that's probably the most, I suppose driving himself into the lake's a pretty bad ending, but I think that's up there with that one, because that's the ending where James just refuses to move on and is just continuing to delude himself, and I think Maria coughing there just sort of shows that that's not going to be a viable solution for him for long.
Yeah, so Mary died, so he hooks up with Maria. Maria gets sick. He smothers her with a pillow, goes back to Silent Hill and picks up Mary Ann, then Michelle, then Melinda, Melissa,
and Mariah.
We have 2 endings you can only get if you're replaying the game. We have the rebirth ending, where James intends to use the artifacts around Silent Hill to revive Mary. We have one of my favorite joke endings from the entire series, the dog ending, in which James learns that he has been controlled by a dog this entire time. It's a cute scene.
Eddie can help him with that.
Yep. Then you have the UFO ending, which was with Restless Dreams, and it's a nod to Silent Hill, in which aliens utilizing Harry from Silent Hill 1 abduct James and go on space adventures. really quickly, just want to run through Born from a Wish real quick. It's just a short little scenario about Maria. She's depressed. She's contemplating suicide.
Yeah, I never really understood that scenario that much.
Yeah, and so Born from a Wish implies that Maria is actually not connected to Mary or James at all, and that she just is another person who wandered into Silent Hill.
I mean, I took Born as from a wish to mean she's born from James's wish, but...
Yeah, I mean, definitely. And it's just like the fanfic he wrote to justify her existence when he gets back to the real world. It's a really short adventure. She goes into a mansion. Not much in there except for a locked door. When she knocks on it, there's a person in the room, and he sends her on a bunch of fetch quests. And when she gets done, she's warned that James is a bad man and she needs to stay away from him. And then she enters the room to find it empty. She contemplates killing herself again, and then decides, no, I'm going to go find this bad man because I'm a person with real mental issues, so I need to involve myself with someone I have reason to believe is not a good person.
And I guess that wraps up Silent Hill 2, although I think it's pretty safe to say we skimmed over a lot of this game, kind of like you opened when we first started talking about it. People have analyzed this game back and forth and implied meanings from all kinds of things, and certainly some of it is there. I mean, there's like the imagery of when you're fighting like the personification of Angela's problems with her father, and it's like some bed monster, and there's all these pistons pumping in and out of the wall to symbolize her trauma, or early in the game when you get the flashlight and it's on a mannequin dressed in Mary's clothes. I don't know if you want to say that that's trying to illuminate you about what really happened there, but there's all kinds of things like this all throughout the game, and I think people have taken it too far in some places, just like you said, but there's definitely a lot there.
Well, and that's the nice thing about Silent Hill and horror in general. A lot of it leaves room for people to interpret it in their own way, and there's nothing wrong with that. People are always going to see things that weren't intentional, but that doesn't make them any less valid. Speaking of that, we have the scene that's almost like it's ripped right out of Seven, where James has to hide and watch Pyramid Head presumably sexually assault a monster. So,
I like that scene just because it's just vague enough that when you watch it, you're not really sure what you're watching. And it kind of looked like he was murdering them or maybe doing something else to them, but you're not totally sure. And I think that's what makes it the best.
Yep. It's definitely a very memorable scene in the franchise pantheon. Did you ever wonder exactly how subjective reality is? And when you turn a game off, does it turn you off as well? Is Skunk Green the perfect accompaniment to Silent Hill 2? Submitted for the approval of Here Is the Horror fan base, I call this tale the tale of sentient silence. So, my first time playing through Silent Hill 2, my parents were out of their house a lot and I was still living here. So, I was sitting at home one night. I was getting very close. I was maybe 3/4 of the way through Silent Hill 2, which I didn't know at the time. So I decided I was going to order a pizza, smoke a little bit of the devil's grass, and play. Well, there were a confluence of extenuating circumstances that influenced this night because it's 1 or 2 o'clock in the morning. I'm in an empty, 90% dark house. I live in a small town where it's quiet except for crickets and insects. And I'm playing Silent Hill 2 with a stereo headset on. And I'm super high. Well, as I begin to play the game, I begin to perceive these things in game which somehow led me to the conclusion that Silent Hill 2 had become sentient. The game knew this. The game knew it was a game. It knew I was playing it, and it decided to actively work against me finishing the game. A lot of this was just, a result of having a good time or what have you, and the mindset I was in and the creepy atmosphere I'd put myself in. But the normal sounds you hear in a house at night, like creaks and pops and stuff like that, they all became amplified to me, and out of every horror movie, horror game, horror book I've ever exposed myself to, this was probably the single most terrifying experience of my life, because the mindset in my head became that if I do not finish this game right now, that I'm going to wake up in Silent Hill, basically. So, in my personal experience, don't play Silent Hill alone in the dark and hide.
This concludes today's mini-sode of Here's the Horror's 3-part series covering Silent Hill 1 through 3. Remember to subscribe and review Here's the Horror for free on the podcast service of your choice and on YouTube. You can also visit our website at here'sthehorror.com and follow Here's the Horror on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. Have anything to say about horror films, games, or novels? Have any topics you'd like us to discuss? Questions, comments, and suggestions can be sent via email to hereisthehorror@gmail.com. Please consider subscribing to Here's the Horror on Patreon. Every little bit helps to support the podcast, and patrons gain access to bonus episodes and more. The opening song is Nightmare Machine by Kevin MacLeod. The interstitial songs are Supernatural Radio by Kevin MacLeod, The Visitor by Shane Ivers, and Engulfed by the Night by Darren Curtis. The closing song is Dealing with the Devil by Darren Curtis. Thank you for listening to today's mini-episode, and remember, stay horrified.
Maybe you meet the polyhedral challenged brute.
Triangle Man.
Phallus knife.
Conehead.
No, I want to redo that. I don't want to call them phallus knives.
I'd planned on commenting on it, but as we've gone on, I'm kind of like, meh.
Only this time. Was that the right anime, Adam? Is that the one?
Yeah, it's the right anime.
Okay.